My name is Jo Applin. I'm the Walter H. Annenberg Professor in History of Art at the Courtauld Institute, and I have very pleased to have been asked to moderate tonight's conversation. And I'm going to introduce my two co-panellists now. What we're going to do is talk for 40 or so minutes between us. And we've got a few topics that we'd like to cover, things we've been talking about together that we thought we might share with the group. We'll then have time for questions from you, and tonight's event is being recorded, so you can re-watch this at your leisure. But that also means that we'd like you to hold on for the microphone in the Q&A if you'd like to speak, just so that we can record that. So I know it feels a bit of a pain, but it is going to be really helpful for future viewers that aren't here tonight. So thank you in advance for that. So tonight I am joined by Charles Martin, who is a London-based lawyer and senior advisor to Rothschild & Co, among other appointments. He is the deputy chairman of Pallant House Gallery and a cousin of the late Lilly Fenichel, and a trustee and founder of the Lilly Fenichel Foundation, which is a UK charity, and he's going to be able to introduce us in much more detail to her work this evening, which is great. And to my left, I have Bella Kesoyan, who is an art historian, writer and editor who is based in London. And Bella's current doctoral research at the Courtauld Institute of Art with my colleague, Professor Sarah Wilson, who's here tonight too, focuses on the influence of the mid-20th century French publishing houses on contemporary American artists' books. Professionally, as well as writing her PhD, Bella also works directly with artists, galleries and advisors to provide historical contexts to the works of art in collections and exhibitions, and her recent projects include exhibitions at the Sir John Soane Museum and the Design Museum in London. So welcome. So we've got far too long a list of topics and questions we will not get through, but I'll just say a few words to maybe set the scene, and then we'll try and dive into some of those. So we're here to think about something that's been loosely grouped together as the women of abstract expressionist. And we were talking about how when you think of abstract expressionism, you tend to think of large-scale canvases, you think of oil, you think of large gestural abstraction, the idea of the grand painterly gesture that is somehow a direct conduit of the artist's emotional, spontaneous, expressive self, somehow captured in that moment on the canvas. But when you walk into this very beautifully put together exhibition, one of the first things certainly that I noticed was the scale and the lack of the big gesture, the big painterly gesture. So perhaps the question of abstract expressionism is one with a bit of a question mark over that we might think about, because there are also lots of other things going on here. I think the European influence that we also see in early abstract expressionist painting is clearly in evidence among many of the works that we'll look at today. And the theme that has united this very excitingly disparate group of works is montage, collage. What a bit later into the 60s becomes known as assemblage. We have these various terms to think about what happens to the canvas when objects beyond paint begin to get applied, stuck, or otherwise reassembled on the surface, and what that means. And I think that's going to be an important theme of what's happening when artists are doing that today, what the materials are, and maybe thinking of these stuck-on elements as a kind of material gesture. You know, it's bringing the world quite literally into the surface, which is different, I think, to a kind of understanding of the emotional outpouring of the self, which was very much coded as the masculine kind of gesture of the early abstract expressionist painters. So we're going to talk a bit about some of the different artists that are in the group, what was happening in and around the States at this time, and we'll also, well, we're going to move in and out of a few topics. Let's just see how that goes. But I think, Bella, we thought we might ask you to say a bit to start with about this role of montage, and perhaps you can select a couple of works to kind of draw out some of those themes and why it mattered at this time.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you, Joe, for the introduction, and thank you, Ghazali, for having this conversation. It's a fantastic exhibition, and for me, as an kind of expert on the medium of paper, it's a fantastic to have this medium brought forward within a movement that canonically is known for, as you said, this large-scale painterly abstraction canvases. And collage is historically a product of the age of mechanical reproduction. And the history starts with the Cubism, with the modern art, and you can definitely see some of the modern art influences in the works of the artists present. But I think the abstract expressionist group of women brings something different to the medium, and you can definitely see it here. First of all, the way we normally think about collage, when you think about how it's constructed, we think about fragmentation and multiplicity and disruption of the pieces of paper by the artists that are then assembled into a single mosaic and assemblage of a work. But I would like to maybe ask you to think about, within this exhibition, the collage as a sense of unity and as a sense of bringing together different materials to, in the most kind of philosophical abstract expressionist thought, to build a form that comes from within the mind of the artist. And although the Abex, the artists of Abex had enormous stylistic differences between them, and it's, again, very visible within the show, but the common idea was to produce a form, mainly an abstract form that comes from within that psyche, the identity of the artist. And for me, these collages speak more about connectedness and unity rather than the disruption and multiplicity. And second thing I would note throughout the exhibition, and especially visible maybe in the collage of Perle Fine, which we have as a fantastic backdrop to the whole conversation, and Yvonne Thomas, which is on my left there. The way with which they worked with paper is very similar to the way they actually worked with the brush. It's kind of the disjointed pieces of paper in a way became the brush strokes, within the canvases that kind of gesturally became the form and the artist's signature. And if we actually look at the Perle Fine collage mobile behind us, that at the time, Perle Fine was actually experimenting by bringing the collage elements into her canvases as well. So for her, the collage wasn't a separate medium. She was already experimenting with the assemblage idea within her large-scale canvases. So this work is more of a continuation of the same topic. So she looks at the same issues as well when she looks at her canvases.
Thank you. So that's very interesting. We often think about the torn paper as a kind of violent kind of disturbance, but you see it as it's just continuing the kind of painterly project. It's about form and placement of shape. That's kind of interesting, perhaps in relation to the Helen Frankenthaler on the wall, because could you say a little about this? Because this is about paper in a slightly different way, I think, and it's, for me, extraordinary to see such a small work by an artist I think of as working on such a grand scale.
I mean, the Frankenthaler's work is not specifically a collage. It is a painting, but the interesting part of it is that it's actually a book. So in 1973, Robert Motherwell designed a book of Frankenthaler's work. And at this point, they've already divorced. So they were married, and in 1971, after 13 years, they separate. And 2 years later, he designs a book, a monograph of her work. And at the time, she and the publisher discuss the potential of production of limited edition of the same publication that is very well thought through tradition, and a lot of artists have been building these, what you would call artist books at the time. But Helen didn't want to interfere with the finished book. She was adamant about not actually disrupting the actual publication. So instead what she did, she produced 62 covers for the publication on canvas. Over the weekends, in a very leisurely manner, over some time period, kind of as a distraction from her main practice, she produced these small-scale paintings that kind of became the front of that publication. And for me, it's an interesting idea because she sort of puts all of her work, her monograph, physically on the back of her painting, kind of, giving it a bit of a sort of hefty backing, because the book is quite thick, actually. And the technique she uses here is the technique that she's coined throughout her practice. It's a soak stain technique that she called it. And when she developed it, she famously said that for her, the light touch is the strongest touch. And she didn't want to see any seams or any hard borders on her canvases. And I think the small work is a fantastic example of this technique.
It's kind of concentrated down in a way that it's it's quite striking to see. So the use of paper here is because it's made into a book, the collage, the idea of it being an additive.
Exactly. But I think it's also quite, unfortunately we can't see it here, but the way the canvas kind of wrapped the book, kind of making a sculpture out of it, because the awareness of the edges of the book, also if you would have one and if you would go through the book, it would, the painting would live a completely different life to the one that paintings normally would live. So I'm sure she was thinking about that as well.
That's great, thank you so much. Well, let's turn to Lilly, and perhaps we thought it would be nice to actually just take a moment to kind of hear a bit about Lilly Fenichel's story and about some of those pieces that we have here. So this feels a nice moment, if you wouldn't mind perhaps doing that for us.
Certainly, certainly. Well, thank you all for coming. Lilly Fenichel, maybe not an artist that many of you have heard of before this exhibition, was my father's first cousin, and she was fierce, funny, independent, brave, and believed in doing everything that she did in her own way and differently. And in the art world, certainly at that time, that didn't go down very well. And that is one reason why she was not, during her lifetime, widely recognized as a commercially successful artist. She liked to say that she didn't make hemline art. She didn't follow fashion. She didn't like being called an abstract expressionist because that was to label her. She didn't like, doing, after her early work, she didn't do lots of big oils on canvas because that's what other people did, and she didn't want to be a slave and categorized in that kind of way to fashion. So she was different. She was part of the tradition of many artists who was born in continental Europe. She was born in Vienna before the war. Went to the US, but went not to New York, like so many abstract expressionists, but actually started in LA. She did spend some time later in New York, and then she ended up at the end of her life in New Mexico. So quite an unusual trajectory and quite a lot of influences. She saw herself as a bit of a misfit. She definitely saw herself as continental European in the US and was proud of that. And that really affected quite a lot of her work. Her work goes through, if you look at the website, you'll see, goes through cycles that look like she was doing very different, very diverse work throughout her life. But actually there are some common threads. Common threads include a passionate interest in the relationship between man and nature. Lots of drawing, and you can see it in, for example, the work that we have. You can't see it where you are, but at the back here, the collage. The heavy drawing component, even when paint is involved. And color harmonies, very, very interested in in the way that colour works. And if you look at the poured work upstairs, you can see that. A real understanding of colour, and that all runs through her work. And, you know, she saw herself, as I said, not as an abstract expressionist, so much as a non-objective painter. And although there are some drawings and various things that are more real world, most of her work is abstract. So those are sort of some of the elements that I think people might like to know that are a bit different.
I think that you're right, that the graphic mark, so this isn't the big painterly gesture, but there's certainly a sense of like the artist's hand at work, even with the collages. This use of the phrase non-objective art, of course, firmly demonstrates her roots in a European tradition that is that she doesn't want to identify with the abstract expressionist field, which is largely happening on the East Coast, in fact. And so she, I think, is our one outlier in being the West Coast, is that correct, out of the artists here?
In the exhibition.
In the exhibition, and so she's working outside of that very particular scene in New York, and she's more around, I guess it's the beats and poetry, and it's a different kind of scene. The art market takes a long time to establish in LA. It's really, it isn't, you know, artists would be either drawn to it because they didn't have to engage with the market, or they found themselves there and there wasn't a market anyway. But either way, it encouraged a certain kind of art making that could be perhaps more experimental, less market friendly, as we would probably put it now. And so her outlier status, I think, is absolutely right, that she's a European artist who finds herself.
And a woman. I mean, you know, that such,
Yes.
you know, the art scene in LA at that time, which was pretty well established, was characterized by a group of artists called, no accident, the Boys Club. Yeah. And she operated sort of on the outskirts of that. She clearly wasn't a member. And, you know, there are parallels with that in New York. You know, you think about the 9th Street exhibition in New York, there were women in there, but it was dominated by men. And even in the women who were in there were, you know, some of them were married to the male artists. It was cliquey, and she was never going to be happy being part of a clique.
Mm. Perhaps more of a sense in LA that was because it goes from no art market to this kind of like the Ferris and the Boys Club that suddenly emerges. There really was no place for women, and Judy Chicago later is very clear about this. Whereas in New York you have Betty Parsons, who is the first kind of work we meet as we come in here, had her galleries in the 40s. I mean, perhaps a slightly more accommodating, or perhaps the Guggenheim. Yeah, exactly. And so I think that Fenichel's kind of feeling distanced from that scene for her was productive, though. She always saw herself as an outlier, which is a kind of...
Suited her personality, by the way.
Interesting, yeah. When did she die?
She died in 2014.
Okay. And she was in New Mexico.
In New Mexico, yeah.
Which, of course, increasingly became kind of a haven for lots of artists. So she finds a kind of that would kind of leave the city and move there, and so that's a kind of interesting kind of move for her to have made, I think. A
lot of art. I mean, it's a very big art scene, as many of you will know. Santa Fe is nearby, and Georgia O'Keeffe was there, and you know, lots of people were there.
Mm-hmm. No, but also Lilly wasn't fully abstract artist as well, because I've been looking at her work. She's also, I mean, you were talking about man and nature, but she was exploring the cityscapes as well quite a lot. Mm-hmm. And there's somewhat surrealist influence in her work as well, so it's only natural that she wouldn't want to be boxed into this kind of abstract movement definition.
Mm-hmm. Correct. Mm-hmm. And that cityscape, I mean, that language of working with the urban, you know, setting in which they're working is something we really associate with many of the New York-based artists who are really working in a, who are kind of bringing that world into the canvas in a way that's kind of interesting. It isn't through the kind of purely abstract gesture, but it's through, it's literal, it's you know, collage, as well as that cityscape scene that we see from Fenichel, which is trying to kind of capture something of that on the canvas.
Yeah, absolutely. But one more point that I wanted to pick up from you, because you've mentioned that New York might have been a bit more friendly to women, and that's what I kind of thought, because the Betty Parsons and Peggy Guggenheim, but then for the 9th Street show, the 11 women that were present in there out of 75 artists, in fact, there was a whole conversation, because Leo Castelli, who famously curated the show, he thought that inclusion of female artists would actually bring down the serious intentions of the exhibition. So there was a prolonged conversation on whether to include the women at all. And the number 11, the number of 11 women, that was a huge win still.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
And it just sounds so surprising, because Betty Parsons was a gallerist and an artist all on her own. Perle Fine was a gallerist as well, up until she actually was signed up by a dealer and could paint full time. So the presence of these women was quite extensive.
And are they promoting work by other women, Perle Fine and Betty Parsons? Is this part
Betty
of
Parsons showed pretty much almost all the women of here present, but it's not just Betty Parsons, not just female gallerist. Grace Hartigan was showing at Tibor Dinalogy Gallery. They were shown, they were written about, but the interesting thing is always the frame in which they were written about. There's a story about another Abex painter whose small oil is actually upstairs, the Amaranthe Ehrenhaut. One of her paintings was shown in Paris in 1962, and John Ashbery, at the time being a poet, but also writing for Herald Tribune, singled out that work in his review of the show. And a couple of months later, she met him and she thanked him for this review, to which he turned around and he said, "Oh my God, Amaranthe, you are a woman. I would have never written this if I knew you were a woman." And that's in her words. She tells her story. And what is surprising is that John Ashbery at the time is best friends with Joan Mitchell. In fact, 2 years before, they finished a book project together. So we're not even looking at kind of another Clement Greenberg here. We're looking at somebody who is fully, accustomed to seeing women's painters, and yet.
Well, and this is interesting. I mean, perhaps you've got something to say about this with Lilly, because I think, yes, it's a show of women artists. Maybe we could talk a bit more about this, about their place in the art world at that time, as we've begun to do, but also their own relationship to that.
Yeah, I mean, Lilly didn't want to be labelled as a woman artist. She wanted to be accepted as an artist. And whenever there was an attempt to sort of include her in a list of women artists or do a group show that was women artists, she wouldn't go along with that, because that wasn't where she wanted to be pigeonholed. I think it is quite. It's really interesting. I agree with everything you said, but although the women artists were being shown, they were like a sort of subset. And the culture, you look at the relationship between Pollock and Krasner, for example. A quote that I picked up was that the male Abex scene in New York was full of boozy macho brawlers. And clearly part of that was all about excluding women who couldn't be a part of that.
Mm-hmm. I would say that Grace Hartigan and Joan Mitchell as well, but other women, Elaine de Kooning, they were quite heavy drinkers themselves as well. So the famous Cedar Tavern, where they were all hanging out at the time, and you have a lot of photographs kind of available online, should you wish to sort of Google it, but you can see they're kind of drinking and brawling together, and the marriages a lot of times were sort of a consequence of them meeting each other and being shown in the same galleries and being friends, and kind of, like in any community, you hang out together, you sometimes end up together. But famously, some of the women that were creating at the time could not quite be described as necessarily very dainty, I would say. But there was some tricks that women did pick up. And for example, the Michael Corinne West changed her name from Corinne to Michael because Pollock, I believe, told her that Corinne West sounds like the name of the debutante's daughter. So she changed it to Michael.
Well, we see, and we see this often, a couple of artists, women artists that I've worked on into the 60s, they both had the name Lee. One was Leonore, one was Lee. And they realized that this would give them immediate access to a gallerist's attention up until the moment where they met them and realized that they were a woman. And so actually having an androgynous name only worked so far because at some point that was an impediment to success. And I suppose we've got the anecdotal evidence that they're kind of joining in, one of the boys, all of this kind of conversation. But at the same time, it's structural, isn't it? There are some gallerists that had a quota. I've got my women artists, or, so whether they were married, whether they were involved and supported, there was something bigger at stake, wasn't there? Which was simply, where do we put these figures? And for women, this was really tough because they didn't want to be, like as Lilly Fenichel says, I don't want to be recognized as a woman artist first, because they knew that would immediately marginalize them. So they would only be in shows of women artists, that would be the first thing anyone talked about. And so what they would do was just disavow this, and they would say things like, Louise Nevelson, when asked to comment on the rise of the women's movement, do your work, she said. She was impatient with this because it was not at that point in any way empowering to promote yourself as a woman artist. They wanted to be considered as equals. Excellence has no sex. It's Simone de Beauvoir. This is what they are reading, and it isn't till the end of the 60s, really, that even a language of feminism emerges that they could go, oh, and you could find a vocabulary, and you could find others, and you could think about this more critically. When you were just trying to find a space for yourself in an art world, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it, that you wouldn't want to kind of single yourself out in a way that will immediately marginalize yourself. And so someone like Joan Mitchell is kind of a fascinating example of someone whose narrative could absolutely be that of one of her male peers.
She famously didn't. Quite a lot of these women didn't want it to be defined by their gender. Grace Hartigan also signed as George, and she signed her canvas as just Hartigan. But then she would actually show up to her opening, and so everybody could see that she was a woman. So, as you say, it worked only to a certain degree. Betty Parsons famously said that she doesn't deal in married couples when she refused to show Ellen de Kooning. So there is a bit. It was a very complicated and tough environment, and I'm in no way saying that it was easy for women. I'm just kind of saying that women were physically present in the same spaces that men were, because I'm sure they felt that was obligatory as well.
And I think it was really tough for them, right? Of the women in the 9th Street show, I think only Grace Hartigan had a child. The rest, none of them had kids. They had to devote themselves solely to their careers. And back to Lilly, it was really tough. She was very good. If you check out the website, you'll see some of the credits that she got from other artists of the time. But she couldn't, for most of her life, make enough to live on purely by being an artist, unlike a lot of the male artists. So she had to be in fashion, in design, in the films. She was in the movie business in LA, alongside being an artist. In the end, when she moved to New Mexico, she gave all that up, but it was tough making a living in New Mexico for her. But she then devoted herself to, and that's when she was happy, really, not trying to make two careers.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So another figure who perhaps, I didn't know much about at all, was Sonja Sekula, who I thought you might say a little about, because this theme of them coming more, some being better known than others and being better established is kind of an interesting theme that runs through the various careers on show here, which were very different kind of standings in a way. And Perle, would you like to say a bit about the Sonja? Perhaps we'll gesture so everyone has to keep turning their neck. You can have a look at the end. But
yes, so that's the work is just next to Helen Frankenthaler's. But so Sonja Sekula was a Swiss artist, but on top of being a woman, she had kind of extra. That's not necessarily, but she had kind of an additional kind of hardship to get through, because she was not only was she a lesbian, she was also she had a case of mental illness, and her homosexuality was considered to be a consequence of that. So that kind of presented an extra challenge for her being recognized as an artist. Although she still showed, Betty Parsons showed her in 1948, and she was one of the artists in the 9th Street show. Because of her mental issues, she had to go back to Switzerland, where she was from, to seek medical help, and ultimately she unfortunately committed suicide in 1963. But her work has quite a lot of influences from surrealists as well. So she was very friendly with André Breton, who wrote a lot of letters to her. And I have a quote here that Charles Duy defined her. Her transparent green, dark-ringed, slightly protruding, and very open eyes added a dreamlike steadfastness to her character. It's beautiful. An invisible cloud enveloped Sonja, giving her gestures a softness and slowness. It's a beautiful description, very French.
We've got some very strong characters.
Very strong characters.
Yeah.
And her painterly style, she was very much kind of projecting its biomorphic forms from the early surrealism, and you can sort of see that in the canvas. And when she moves back to Switzerland, she focuses on smaller works on paper, partly because of her health, partly because she preferred paper as a medium. And I believe this is actually one of the works she makes already after her return.
Because this also has sand in, and I think we've talked about paper, but actually there's some quite interesting materials happening in a few of these. And I think these two, as you come in, are kind of interesting works. The Betty Parsons wooden assemblage it's coming out of a moment where people were starting to use words like assemblage, junk, this idea of reassembling an abstract object from the stuff of the world, the detritus, the found object, which of course has a long surrealist tradition too. And then we have this, as you say, very surrealist biomorphic forms here with the Sekula, but they feel like they're of a slightly different order to the other works, because it isn't about paper in that way. These are on the way to sculpture, or somehow wrestling with what it is to be a two-dimensional work with three-dimensional aspects, and sort of its relationship to the wall and the space. I just find these ones kind of interesting, and particularly in relation to, I can't see it, you can see it, the Nancy Grossman around here, which was another surprise to me. I think of her as an assemblage artist from the 60s who would stick really thick pieces of leather and nails and cut. She would take an ice skating boot and would cut it up and stuck it to the surface, and she would use rope and string, and her works feel like sculpture trying to burst off the wall, like they're heavy things. But earlier, this is much more a collage work, and it really is absolutely of the moment, where she has quite a close friendship with David Smith, the sculptor, sort of affiliated with Abstract Expressionism, large metal abstract sculptures, and and he dies in the early 60s, but just before he dies, he gives her some materials that she then incorporates into some of her reliefs. So this is an interesting kind of intergenerational, because what she does with his materials is not what David Smith would have done with his materials. They become quite erotic, they become quite violent, but she's nonetheless kind of literally in conversation with his stuff. And so we have a paper version of her collage here, but there's something about these artists being on the cusp of doing something different, like you say with Lilly, like wanting to just not fit. So maybe that's to do with the materials, the scale. You know, if these are abstract expressionist artists, it's of a completely different order to Willem de Kooning, or although he used collage in some of his, let's not use him. He's a kind of another interesting.
He does quite a bit of
the Pollocks, the kind of, but this idea of the gestural painterly mark. We're just in a very different world, aren't we?
We are, and I think you're right in that frontier between sculpture, collage, painting, and drawing gets erased quite a lot during this time. Because I mean, with Betty Parsons' work, she starts collecting these pieces of leftover wood around her, where she lived in Long Island, and starts painting on top of them, kind of also calling them collages, but they're not specifically paper collages.
She calls them collage.
Yes.
Oh, interesting.
And so does Grossman with her large-scale metaworks. She calls them drawings in space, and she calls them collages sewn together. And Grossman, for me, she's much more physically into the body as an idea of where the work comes from. She grew up on a farm, and maybe that sort of that background had kind of influenced her in that way. But she believes that, you know, leather and fabric and wood and other materials, these are all body. These are all, you know, natural and earthy materials, and that's why she kind of uses them and stitches them together. But she also doesn't want the stitches to be visible. Her ultimate goal is to create a form, just as much as you know, other abstract expressionists. And I think you can see that in the collage. You can see that pieces of paper become almost a single form, and they kind of get a bit of a skin-like quality. If it's so soft, and the edges of that work are like, for me, that's what that collage speaks to me about. It's that sort of still leather, but kind of done through the medium of the paper. And then just the way she thinks about sort of the physicality comes through afterwards, because her next body of work are her famous heads. That's what she kind of starts doing right after that. And that's because she kind of starts thinking about that everything, all the feelings and all the love and everything important comes from the head. So that's kind of another point of how important the actual physical body was for her.
I think it's also about challenge, isn't it? It's about, you know, I think about Lilly, as I said, she went through different phases, because once she felt that she'd kind of done what she wanted to do, she couldn't just carry on, which would have been commercially the right thing to do, no doubt. She had to stop and then have a period during which she did nothing while she figured out what her next phase was going to be. And a really good example, and we haven't got anything here, was a phase where she actually started making what looked like little tables, little sculptures, and she made them herself. Somebody taught her how to be like a carpenter, and she loved the challenge because it wasn't easy, because it didn't come naturally to her. She came from a very privileged background. The idea of actually sort of doing DIY and building a table with kind of wood was just like a fantastic challenge for her. She really relished. She went through that phase, and then in the end, as you can see upstairs, she found, when she wasn't able to paint anymore, a completely new to her, invented by her, a medium and way of working, which was pouring acrylic paint onto a plasticized surface that she discovered. So this was all about just doing something that was kind of novel and original and of her creation, that allowed her to carry on producing art at a time when she otherwise would have had to have stopped. So it's about reinventing yourself and finding challenge and not, not conforming to some norm.
Do you think that part of her lack of recognition at the time was due to her refusal to kind of work within the same mode, that she kept changing? Did people find it hard to place?
Totally. I mean, I said she didn't believe in fashion. She didn't want to follow fashion. Part of the reason for that was because she equated that with being commercial, and she didn't want to be commercial. She didn't think art should be commercial. And, any galleries, the galleries she spoke to, and she did have a number of exhibitions, but she never really had a continuing relationship with the gallery because she wouldn't produce what people wanted to buy. She would produce what she felt she needed to produce, wanted to produce.
Really, I mean, this taps into something that we've talked about, which is this idea that tends to kind of get promoted, that somehow women artists are discovered as though they were hidden and nobody knew they were there. And of course, what we're hearing is all these different lives that people were having and living, and career trajectories that might not map directly onto what we think of as a classic successful career, but which nonetheless were visible and present and exhibited. I wonder if we could just maybe say a little bit about that, because I think it's quite important, isn't it? And it's clearly, in the case of some of these artists we've talked about, not about the discovery, but about I don't know, what is it, noticing that their absence at the time, or that it wasn't?
I think maybe at the time, that sort of framing and the challenges the women went through kind of not naturally, but put them at a disadvantage. And some people ask us like, oh, why now? But it's not necessarily a question of why now, it's a question of finally, rather than a moment in time. But there are a couple of factors that always come before that belated recognition, and I believe there is for the 9th Street women, it's been several things and several big museum shows over the past maybe 10 years that kind of prompted this new interest. Because in 2015 you have a huge National Portrait Gallery of Washington exhibition of Ellen de Kooning's portraits. And then 2016, Denver Art Museum puts on a huge show of abstract expressionist women. And then only 2 years after that, the book comes out, which is 9th Street Women book. And that sort of all together reinforces the new levels of also art historical interest. Because then you have this kind of new spark, a new generation of art historians looking into that, and producing research and kind of looking at what actually happened and why the women have been overlooked. So I believe that, and then since then, and then there was a Whitechapel show, so you have this kind of constant spark of new interest and new knowledge about these women.
And it's a way of rethinking abstract expressionism differently, but it's about kind of expanding that cast of characters to think in more maybe expansive ways. Like we had the Lee Krasner show in whichever year that was, a couple of years ago, at the 2018.
But there's also an appetite, because that constant idea of a boys' club, there was an appetite, I believe now, to see that there maybe wasn't just a boys' club. So you have this kind of people looking into it and discovering that there was just as much female talent.
Yeah, and it's back to that question, I think, of about kind of systems and structures that could enable them, rather than, as I say, the individual successes that we know of and those who could kind of adapt and fit within that. It's to do with the surprise. John Ashbery's just surprised that this work was fitting within a category that he just did not
expect. Exactly.
Absolutely. Would you like to add anything, or is this a time to open to?
No, I mean, I think it is remarkable how, following on from the Denver show, if that's the right place to start, there has been an increased appreciation. It's not like a rediscovery, because for all the reasons we talked about, this stuff was there, it was recognized, but it wasn't fully appreciated. And I think we're seeing a different lens and a lot more interest. And it's worth mentioning that one of the big collectors of this work, Christian Levitt, has opened a dedicated museum in the south of France, in Mougins, in the last couple of weeks, with some fantastic examples of all the work that we've been talking about. And that I think is also going to be a magnet for increased interest in this.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you both. Perhaps I think we're about the time where we're going to see if anyone has any comments or questions you'd like to direct to our panellists. Someone has a microphone who will be roving about. Oh, there you are.
There you go.
Thank you. Yeah, there's somebody at the back. Just 1 second.
Sorry, is it me?
Yeah, it's you.
I probably don't need a microphone. Talking about boys' clubs, I've always been interested in the Cobra movement. And even though it was quite a short period of time that they covered, I just wondered if there was ever any connection with these women. I do realise the difference between European abstract expressionism and American expressionism, but I just wondered if anybody knew about that connection, if there was any.
Thank you.
I believe Cobra movement was primarily European, and there was a huge kind of flow. I mean, during the war, there was a flow of kind of expatriates from Europe to US, of course, but then after the war, there was a huge amount of American artists going to Europe, and again, creating that community, cross-medium, cross-movement community of the artist. And I'm sure there was definitely a social connection between the different artists. But Joe, would you know about any specifics?
Not with these, no. Does anybody else?
I know the person to ask would be Jacqueline de Jong, who is the female...
Oh, 1 second, Sarah, because we're recording. Thank you.
Sorry, I just said the person to ask would be Jacqueline de Jong, the female artist of the Cobra group, who's alive and flourishing. And as you say, there were lots of to and fro's. But as I got the mic...
She just died. She died.
Oh, when?
2 or 3 days ago.
Oh my God.
I went to the Chelsea Arts Club with her and things. How dreadful, thank you. And I know that she knew this artist I wanted to ask you about called Shoshana, who was born in Vienna and had a career in America and then back in Europe. So there's lots of to's and fro's. I just wanted to be very wicked in terms of going back to a man and asking about the assemblage exhibition at the moment, and Motherwell turning to collage, because Robert Motherwell's collages were very important and very, I presume, well appreciated. And I just wondered, if his collages are allowed to be part of a certain collage discourse, because it's very interesting. I've never seen these collages before.
Thank you.
I think this whole question of the relationship between the US abstract expressionism and Europe is very interesting. I mean, obviously, Lilly regarded herself as very European, albeit brought up in the US, and to some extent, the New York-based abstract expressionists crashed onto the European scene back in the 50s, and with a number of exhibitions in order to sort of startle the post-war art elite in Europe. And some of the artists came and worked in Europe too, like Joan Mitchell, obviously. But it was a sort of cultural. I think in the US it was used as a sort of cultural tool to show how cool and liberal the US was and how old school Europe was. And there are a number of, as you probably know, conspiracy theories around that and what lay behind it. But the US government was supportive of that.
Yeah,
The CIA supported it. Yeah. So there was, it was used, interestingly, as a sort of cultural weapon.
But in general, the collage, I think, becomes prevalent within the movement across the board. So de Kooning spent a lot of time developing collage, and Motherwell as well. So within the movement, collage was not necessarily a trait. And sometimes, it's kind of sad that women maybe, produce smaller scale works or things like that. Within ABEX, I wouldn't say that was the case. I think the actual development of collage was brought on by that modernist influence. Because in 1929, a month after the market crashes, MoMA opens, and then all those, cubists and modernists that are brought in, and Motherwell and Pollock and de Kooning, they all see that, and they all see that history. And they all had to get through Cubism to get to where they were, and of course, touch collage as a medium then as well.
Of course, and this language, so we have the art of assemblage in 1961 at MoMA, we have montage, collage, all of these kind of different vocabularies that in a way we've kind of siphoned off the women here, which works really beautifully for this exhibition. But of course, there are many overlaps with their contemporaries. Willem de Kooning is cutting out the smiles of women models from magazines, and he's pasting them into his paintings. Jackson Pollock's working on the floor, and cigarette butts and pennies and matches are getting trapped under the thick kind of pools of paint. So accidental or not, he knew they were there. And so this idea of the gestural kind of oil painting versus the cutout collage is slightly kind of, we've kind of exaggerated it in a way to kind of dramatize what's happening here. Oh, here's a question.
It's interesting you mentioned Jackson Pollock. I wanted to ask if you know, or if anybody's found the collages that Jackson Pollock is supposed to have made. Apparently, I think according to Lee Krasner, Pollock made some collages, and there is at least one painting where we see some piece of paint cut out, pulled off the hardboard. They would call it masonite.
Yeah.
We call it hardboard, where it's pulled away. So he's kind of pulled away a skin of paint to use for collage, and apparently he made them, but nobody's ever found them. Do you know anything about that?
I know that they are kind of famously lost, aren't they?
Yeah. I think he pasted, so we get the kind of cut out negative space.
Some of his lines, some of his swirls and swoops, and cut them out. Yeah. Okay. The other thing, while I've got the microphone, it was really interesting to hear that how Lilly Fenichel was on the West Coast. Is that right? Yeah. And the New York School, ABEX bunch were over in New York. Arshil Gorky was an artist that I thought of as soon as I saw that one in there. I mean, it's 1961, it's much later than Arshil Gorky was influencing those artists. But do you have anything to say about that? I mean, I love Arshil Gorky. I think I love that collage and the way that she's graphically added to it as well. And the marks look very much like Arshil Gorky. Did she have, and they're either side of the country. Was there any connection between the two?
Well, although she was brought up in LA and studied in San Francisco and was sort of influenced there, she did spend time in the 50s and early 60s in New York. In fact, she taught at MoMA. She taught classes at MoMA. And she was certainly influenced. You can see in a lot of her early work, if you know the artists who she was studying with at the Chouinard School in San Francisco, you can see that earlier on in her career, she was more directly influenced by people around her. I think she got her own voice and her own style, and was very much more her own artist as she went through her career. But, and you can see it with the piece upstairs, the large oil upstairs, it looks, like quite a lot of abstract expressionist work of the period, in very gestural, oil, big canvas, all of that. She gave that up as she got more mature as an artist, but it wouldn't surprise me that she came across Gorky and that, experimented with some of the things that she was seeing early on in her career. I don't know that, but it's possible.
Sorry, if I could just quickly add to that, because The artist that Gorky influenced probably most of all within the show is Michael West, because she actually meets him quite early on in her career, and they have a relationship of about 2 years. She never admitted to that relationship being romantic, but there are letters that Gorky writes to her throughout those years, and they're beautiful love letters. But he completely reshaped her understanding about art as a kind of very young painter, because she started as an actress, and then she comes to New York, and then she meets Gorky, and then he introduced her to Pollock. And then that starts her off as a thinker, as a poet, and as a painter. And there's a fantastic collage with her charcoal strokes in there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Some of these women were actually quite successful during their lifetime. They were in group show, they were in solo show. Some of them were acquired by major museums in America and even in Europe. And then as soon as they died, they just dropped. But they are, if you look through the website of the Whitney, MoMA, the Met, I don't know about those here in the show, but Alice Mason and Dorothy Dana. So is there any kind of movement or sort of initiative to mine the storage, these miles and miles of storage in museum to give them some visibility and commercial value again? Or are people aware that it even exists?
I mean, the opening of Chris Levitt's Mougin Museum, that is definitely huge. And there's a publication that was made a couple of years before now, which is called Abstract Expressionism, The Women, that is basically based on his collection. But you're right. I mean,
Christian Levitt is a private collection.
Yes.
But they are almost, if you look through the website, it's quite difficult to find them, but they are there.
Yeah.
They're not on display, but they.
Well, they are on display now at Mougin. As of a couple of weeks ago, that opened. And the collection, you're right, is fantastic. And it is covered in this book, Abstract Expression, The Women, which has got some great text with it too. It's a really good thing. Look, I think you're right. I'm sure there is a huge amount of work to be discovered sitting in archives, and a lot more to come. So I think that's quite exciting.
I mean, when I was Joe's student in 2017, suddenly you saw them appearing on the secondary market. Joan Mitchell, Helen Frankenthaler, and now of course they've been snapped up by private collectors. But there's still a lot in major museums.
You mean not just the archives, right, but actually the works are in stores that are just not getting put on the walls and so on.
Definitely. I mean, they're available on the website.
Yeah.
They've got no visibility, so we can't appreciate them. We can't see them because.
I think the question of historic hanging in the museums is quite an interesting one. And I think in the UK specifically, we've had Tate Britain recently reimagining the way they hang the works and what artists they put forward, not within specifically this movement, but in general throughout their whole collection. And I think it's been going on. It's started some time ago, and you will see this happening inevitably, not just for women, but for queer artists and for artists of different backgrounds. That just is something that, unfortunately, as museum industry goes, takes quite a long time.
But it's definitely on the minds of curators putting together exhibitions now. Gender mix and other appropriate representation is definitely one of the criteria that people are looking at. And that's bound to mean that people look into the archives, they're looking for new stuff to discover in order to incorporate in those exhibitions. So we're going to see more of it.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
I could respond just quickly. Sonja Sekula, the artist who is Swiss, who had mental illness, and MoMA had a large work of hers up for years. I mean, incredible work. I think they've just now put it in storage again, but it was out for a long time. And I think because she's not well known, people may have looked at it and not known the whole story. But in terms of her visibility, there's not a lot of work out there. So it's harder. When you have estates who have a deep amount of work, they can keep promoting and marketing the artist year after year. And I think that's part of the difficulty when it comes to some of the female artists who didn't create as much work. I mean, Frida Kahlo did 200 paintings, for example. But anyways, I just wanted to mention that was out for a while. Great talk, by the way.
Thank you. Anyone else? Well, in that case, let me just thank you all for coming. Thank my panelists, and perhaps this is a nice moment for you to go and look at some of the things we've been talking about instead of craning your necks round the corner. But thank you both very much. That was great. Thank you.